Good morning, everyone. My name is Suri Moon. I'm a professor here at the Geneva Graduate Institute. Colleagues, friends, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to this year's open briefing to all of you joining us in person here in Geneva, as well as those of you joining us online from around the world. This is the 12th annual introduction to the major issues facing the World Health Assembly. It's an opportunity to hear from leading thinkers and actors, to reunite with old friends, and hopefully to meet some new ones. On behalf of the UN Foundation and the Global Health Center here at the Geneva Graduate Institute, it's my great honor to open this year's event. The title this year, as you can see, is Can Global Health Make Progress Amidst Rupture? And some of you may have guessed that the title is inspired by the diagnosis that Mark Carney, Prime Minister of Canada, made a few months ago here in Switzerland. He said, "We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. International rules are being blatantly violated, which is a dangerous erosion that has increased insecurity worldwide." Prime Minister Carney said, "When the rules no longer protect you, you must protect yourself." And understandably, countries are looking for ways to do just that. They feel they can no longer rely, as they could before, on international cooperation. COVID kick-started this move towards health sovereignty, but recent events have made some hit the accelerator. But the desire for health sovereignty is running up against a very hard reality of health interdependence, which is basically that no country can fully protect the health of its people on its own. Let me just remind us of two very recent examples that illustrate this. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz is disrupting supply chains for life-saving medicines and humanitarian assistance. It also means fertilizer is not going to reach many farmers at the peak of planting season, throwing 45 million people into acute food insecurity. A war taking place in one region is posing new challenges for health worldwide. The second example, widely covered in the media, is of course the passengers and crew of the MV Hondius, where the hantavirus outbreak affected people from 23 different nationalities, involved 30 different countries in the effort to repatriate and contain the outbreak, and within a very short time span, an outbreak on a single ship directly affected the Americas, Africa, Europe, and Asia. Both of these examples remind us that countries cannot address health threats without relying somewhat on others. The paradox is that health sovereignty can only be achieved by strengthening how we govern health at the international level. Which brings us to why there is so much focus today on the global health architecture, which we'll hear much more about later today. Prime Minister Carney warned, the very architecture of collective problem solving is under threat, and the health sector is no exception. Here's another recent example. Since 2021, countries have been trying to negotiate fair, new international rules on pathogen access and benefit sharing, and this annex is the last piece of the puzzle that has to fall into place to complete the pandemic agreement. But while the building is still being constructed, we have discovered termites in the wood. So the past few months have witnessed a growing number of bilateral agreements in which countries receive funding in exchange for access to pathogen samples and data. These bilateral agreements offer short-term benefits to the countries involved, and it's understandable why some countries are signing on. But termites in the wood undermine efforts to construct a house that will be strong enough to protect everyone. So the debate over the global health architecture reform has become much more urgent because of historic cuts in official development assistance in the past year. These cuts have been brutal, and they're cutting short the lives of many people today. Much of the architecture debate is focusing on how to divide up a shrinking pie and who is allowed to eat how much of which slice of pie. But I just want to remind us that the global health challenges facing us today extend far beyond development aid. ODA will not be enough to convince parents to vaccinate their children. It's not enough to stop climate change, which is harming the health of those least responsible for causing it. It won't stop the epidemic of addiction to social media that's threatening the mental health of our young people and older people. And it won't stop hospitals from being bombed in war zones with impunity. Many countries that used to receive ODA no longer do. And so the key idea I'd like to put on the table is that the debates have to move beyond fighting over a smaller pie. And because it's already almost lunchtime here in Geneva, I'd like to say that we have to think about the whole meal, with the pie just being one relatively small part of the meal. So back to the architecture. One of the problems with architecture is that buildings are not easy to change by design. You can add a new room, you can add a swimming pool, you can make the garden bigger, and this is actually what we've done in global health for the last 20 years, partly because buildings are hard to change. And so today, a lot of the debate is about, should we knock down a wall? Should we combine a couple bedrooms into a bigger one? Should we build a new building instead, especially one that would be outside of Geneva? And the question I'd like to put on the table is, are we actually thinking about this in the most useful way? Should we think about global health not as a building with an architect, but as an ecosystem? Because ecosystems function on the principle of self-organization. They're complex. What governs an ecosystem is not an architect, but the laws of nature, like gravity. So what if we start thinking about global health as an ecosystem that has grass and trees and mushrooms and insects and birds that can work together to produce a healthy, well-functioning ecosystem? Or in other words, how national and regional and global institutions can work together. But allow me to wrap up and to come back to the title of this event, in particular, the first part. I've been focusing a lot on rupture, but let me ask, can global health make progress? And we've made tremendous progress. If we think back to the year 2000, since then we've cut under 5 mortality by half. A tremendous achievement. If we look at worldwide life expectancy, there have been gains across the board, 6.4 years worldwide, across all regions, and importantly, we have seen inequalities between regions reduce. So a rupture is not the moment to give up. Actually, instability is a window for change, and that's not just a conventional saying, it's actually a social science finding. So at this moment, let me put a few questions on the table that I hope we can spend the next 2 hours together discussing. How can we defend and repair our critical institutions like the World Health Organization? How can we agree on rules that work for all countries? To me, that is the critical question behind the PABS Annex. Who are the leaders who will step up in this moment? And what's the vision that can inspire and pull us forward? So on that note, let me step back from the microphone and offer you a quick overview of our program and our esteemed speakers who will help us to answer these questions. In the first part of our program, my colleague, Professor John Lucaberci, will provide us with an overview of key issues on the Assembly agenda this year, which will be followed by an opportunity for question and answer. Next, Dr. Hanan Balki, Regional Director of the Eastern Mediterranean for WHO, will offer her high-level reflections on the joint process to reform the architecture, or the ecosystem, with an opportunity again for Q&A. Then we'll shift into a more conversational mode with a panel of 4 distinguished thinkers and leaders, and my colleague, Dr. Sesi Mandaka-Shah, will introduce them. And again, there will be an opportunity for Q&A, so I hope you're all getting ready to throw your tough questions and challenges to our very esteemed speakers today. After closing the event, we're pleased to invite you all for a late lunch. I hope you can hold your hunger until then, co-hosted by our partners at the Institute of Philanthropy, where we'll have the opportunity to reflect further on global health diplomacy as an enabler of health sovereignty and a healthier global ecosystem. So I thank you, and I give the floor to my colleague, Professor Burchi.
Thank you, Suri. I'm waiting. Yeah, here we go. Yeah, I don't know what's wrong with these microphones, but okay. Okay, so many thanks. Good morning to everybody. I will give you a bit of a nuts and bolts introduction to what happens next week, how the WHO will be run, and so on. If you're a veteran of these briefings, you may find it a bit boring because inevitably I will repeat things that I said in previous briefings, but it may be useful for the first timers, and anyway, I think a reminder is always useful. So, these are the points that I will briefly touch, and there will be some question at the end if you have some time, if you have questions. The first point is who participates. So if you are participants, either member states, NGOs, members of the public, you go up to the Palais, you go to WHO. It's a very compressed session, very short, very dense agenda. Everybody's running around, a lot of people, and you wonder, who are they? Who actually has a role to play in the Health Assembly? So, first of all, obviously, member states, but it goes beyond member states. Member states, as you know, WHO 194. I don't think that every member states participate, and in particular countries like the Pacific Islands have to spend 2-3 days just to reach Geneva. But you'd be surprised at the effort that they make to come in Geneva. The WHO is their moment, it's extremely important for them. So it tends to be very well attended. As you know, the United States and Argentina have indicated their intention to withdraw from WHO, so they will not be represented here. The delegations have different sizes. Some are very small. Most developing countries can afford only a few people, with big challenges in following the work. Other countries are huge delegations. Last year, China has 150 persons registered. I'm not sure this year, but you can expect a similar kind of participation. As I said, the participation goes way beyond member states. So you have the list is a bit there. You have intergovernmental organization, partners of WHO. Last year, the Health Assembly admitted the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So they are normally sister agencies and technical partners of WHO. Then you have Palestine and the Holy See that have been specifically invited by the Health Assembly. Palestine has received enhanced rights of participation in 2024, so it's treated almost like a member state. It cannot vote and so on, but I think it can even sit among member states. So it has a unique position in WHO. Then there's a number of observers in the course of time invited by the Director General. And very importantly, there is the public. I think many of you look young, so you may be students, you may be people that will attend as members of the public. That is constrained by the logistics, the limitation in space, and also by the fact that most meetings now are webcast. So in a way, you don't have to be physically present there. But it's a big difference between looking at something on a screen and being physically in the place. So these are more or less the range of actors that you will see next week, or you may already be part of some of these actors. So in terms of no-state actors, the WHO has adopted in 2016 what we call the FENS, Framework of Engagement for No-State Actors, that divides the no-state actors with which the organization cooperates in the number of categories. And these 3 categories can be admitted by the Executive Board into official relations, which entitles them to attend the Health Assembly, the Executive Board, and other WHO meetings. And the admission of these entities has become more controversial in the course of time. It's not just a shoe-in. You have issues of business associations that are seen as too close to certain industries that are seen as not particularly friendly with WHO. You have sometimes political questions, like questions of gender, organizations that work on sexual and reproductive rights. So it's not always smooth sailing, but that's the main way to get in. Something that distinguishes WHO is the possibility of admitting philanthropic foundations. For example, the Gates Foundation that has been admitted in official relations. So if you go to the Palais, you'll see a lot of NGOs running around. And obviously, the formal rights are relatively limited. They can make a statement, they can receive documents, but the real interest, the real importance, be physically there, to lobby delegation, to consult with them, to bring their own experience, to help developing country delegations in getting up to speed on many items. So they play an essential role. And in that sense, COVID was an absolute disaster, because for 2 years, that physical presence was denied. Thank God we are back to business, but that was a moment of shock, I think, for the very logic of a body like the Health Assembly. So how does the WHO work? As I said, it's a very short session. It's about a week compared to, say, the General Assembly of the UN that meets for the whole year. There have been requests in the past to extend the session, never got any traction. People like it short, it's cheaper, and it's more focused. But obviously, there's a price to pay because it's very intense and the agenda is always very crowded. This year, in case you don't know, the logistics are more complicated because the Palais is under renovation, and so WHO has at its disposal only this room, the plenary. And so the plenary and Committee B will meet at the Palais. Committee A will meet in WHO. So if you see many sweaty delegates with sneakers running up and down the hill, it's because they are shuttling between committees. And so it's a challenge for small delegations that have to follow many things at the same time. So there is a very useful WHO app that was set up and improved by the Secretariat in the course of time. If you're a participant, you must download it because it gives you in real time what is discussed where and if items have been moved between committees and so on. It's an essential tool to navigate a very compressed, very, hectic pace. So first of all, obviously the Assembly has a president, and it will be the Minister of Health of the Dominican Republic this year. And the two main committees, I'll say in a moment what they are about, have a chairperson, two vice chairpersons, one rapporteur. The point to strike here is that WHO is very, very careful about the regional rotation. There is a very difficult alchemy in always making sure that the various regions have their own representation. And that used to be for many years the legal counsel of WHO, so sitting on the podium next to the chairs. Sometimes it's a challenge to find skilled chairpersons, and it makes a huge difference if you have somebody who can read and navigate the room and somebody who is unable. And this, also mechanical regional rotation sometimes, very frankly, does not always guarantee good chairpersons. But anyway, let's hope for the best. So this is the plenary, and this is the EB room in WHO. The WHO, the meeting will not take place there. It will take place in another conference room, but it will look more or less like this one. So, how does the assembly work? So, and how is it broken down? There are many bodies that work during the week. The plenary, which is the most, if you want, solemn and formal occasion, is the main body, but it does relatively little work because there is a general debate, it adopts the agenda, but mostly it adopts work that is done in the two main committees, which are Committee A and Committee B. Committee A is the busiest because it deals with technical and programmatic issues, which are the biggest part of the agenda. The budget, interestingly, is seen in Committee A, is seen as a program of work and not a financial item. This year is not a budget year, so you will not see it there, but anyway. The Committee B is administrative, financial, legal, there are progress reports, and most importantly, it deals with the item, in this case, two items on Palestine, on the occupied Palestinian territories. It's less busy, so sometimes you have items moved between committees, as I said before. You have other bodies, and I will not take too much time, but one body that sometimes becomes quite controversial is the General Committee. The General Committee is like the Bureau of the Health Assembly. It looks at the provisional agenda, it sort of organizes the schedule of work, but it does two important things. The first, it looks at items that have been proposed directly to the Assembly. And this year there are two. The first is admitting Taiwan as an observer. It's an item that's been recurring for many years, but the second is an item proposed by a number of Gulf countries, Middle East countries, about Iran unprovoked attack against health facilities across the Gulf. So the General Committee will have to look at these two items separately and make a recommendation to the Health Assembly. So the Health Assembly decided a long time ago that there would be only two parallel meetings, in particular to help small delegations. But there are multiple meetings, in particular drafting groups, informal meetings. So again, it's a very challenging environment, and sometimes people have to work until late in the night. An important point is that the WHO is Global Health Week. The global health community descends upon Geneva. The UN Foundation has a fantastic list of the events that take place next week, and it makes you dizzy. There is something every 15 minutes. So it's really a very important moment for a global health community that goes way beyond the WHO. There are meetings everywhere. And that to me is one of the very important aspects of these meetings. So the Health Assembly is not just a talk shop. It's there to take decisions, adopt decisions, resolutions, and so on. And sometimes, in particular, if you're there for the first time, you wonder how these decisions are taken. Where are they coming from, and how does the Assembly work? That's, in a way, the main reason for the Health Assembly to be there. First of all, there has been a clear attempt to avoid surprises. In the past, sometimes resolutions were introduced on Thursday, and the Assembly was finishing on Saturday. That's very disruptive. So if there are new resolutions, they can only be submitted until Monday night. So there is time for consideration. Many resolutions come from the Executive Board or are negotiated informally by the permanent missions in Geneva. It's quite common the missions would meet informally for weeks. So what comes to the Assembly is a semi-finished product with a high level of consensus that makes the work of the Assembly easier and more rational. Then the draft resolution and decision are discussed in the main committees. And very often when there are many amendments or there are controversial issues, the committees established drafting groups that may meet at lunchtime, meet in the morning, meet in the evenings, and so on. And some of you may be sitting until late in these drafting committees. And then sorry if I go to the nuts and bolts, but if you're there, sometimes it's very confusing. The draft resolution is adopted by the committee, but then the committee adopts the report to the plenary. And many delegations are confused and they think they can reopen a resolution when the report is considered, and they cannot. So there is bad mood and challenges and so on. So there are several steps, and they're finally adopted in the plenary. So like many other organizations, WHO is based on the principle of consensus. So basically adopting decision without a formal vote. A formal vote where you have to raise your hand and say yes, no, or abstain is seen as a failure. All the attempts are made to avoid that. There are many different views. Is that a good approach, or sometimes it's better to vote? Because consensus gives a veto, and vetoes sometimes are used by big, powerful countries. Very difficult for a weak country to stand in the way. And so in a way it creates imbalances. So when does the Assembly have a formal vote? First of all, in the elections, obviously the Director General, but also the external auditors. In more controversial items, typically Palestine, but also the items since 2022 on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But also, and many people lament that, there is a tendency to more politicization of the Health Assembly, and so more frequent votes. For example, last year the Assembly adopted a global action plan on climate change and health. And several countries, in particular fossil fuel producing countries, tried to delay it, to amend it, and so there were a number of votes. Oddly enough, last year the Assembly adopted a pandemic agreement, and Slovakia asked for a vote for internal reasons, perfectly legitimate, but very unusual to have a vote on something like this. But the agreement was adopted by more than 110 votes. So in a way, the vote showed the level of support. It turned out in something positive, even though sometimes people are afraid. Okay, coming to the end, what is discussed? Anyway, you're there for the first time, you look at the agenda and you wonder, why are these items on the agenda? Where do they come from? Why is this discussed and not something else? The agenda of the Health Assembly is a relatively complex process, and the gatekeeper is the Executive Board. The Executive Board in January decides the agenda that will be seen by the Health Assembly. Health Assembly can make changes, but the EB functions as a filter. So the items on the agenda are organized in various pillars to give a certain consistency. And the pillars follow what we call the general program of work, which is a 5-year, 6 years strategic plan of WHO. So and so if you look at the agenda, you will see that there are like titles: provide health, protect health, promote health, and then an oddly titled power and performance that sounds like a protein drink, but it's actually management and the work of the Secretariat. So the items that you see on the agenda come from these sources. There are sometimes new items filtered by the board. There are so-called statutory items like human resources, financial reports, the budget that must come. They're part of the management or the organization. There are often recurring items from previous WHAs. And yet the attempt has been to avoid constant repetitions because they crowd the agenda for no big benefit. So to space them out, to come back every 3, 4, 5 years. There are supplementary items. As I said, this year is Taiwan and this item on Iran. There are progress reports that also look at Committee B, and it seems like business as usual, but there are many countries that are very attached because the progress reports touch issues of big importance to them. So it's something that should not be underestimated, and they're treated very seriously by the Secretariat. And then finally, another decision, when there are global strategies that will expire next year, the Health Assembly will look at them this year to decide what to do. And with a year of time, in case there are adjustments or something has to be sunsetted and so on. I don't think this year there any such thing. So that's how the Assembly, the agenda looks like. That's how to read it and to read between the lines. So the last 2 slides to give you a flavor of some of these items. And I'm not a public health person, so I'm not terribly familiar with many of the technical items. But I look at the agenda, and it doesn't seem to be anything earth-shattering from a technical point of view. But there are some governance and political items that are very important. Governance, there is 2 reports on operational efficiencies, and another one that I didn't put there, the report on human resources. I invite you to read it, that gives a summary of what the WHO has been doing since last year to live with a much reduced budget. So realignment, prioritization, mergers, and so on. It's an important report to look at how WHO is navigating a much more difficult financial situation. The other items that will be discussed by Dr. Balki and by the panel, so I will not say much, is the reform of the global health architecture. Professor Moon has already framed it very well in the introduction. There is a decision coming to the Health Assembly to create a joint task force composed of member states, but also of other partners, global health initiatives, the World Bank, other UN entities that should very ambitiously, in shy of 1 year, come back next year with proposal on a roadmap for the reform of global health architecture. Extremely ambitious. I invite you to look at the report. And, it would be important to position WHO in a debate which has been going on. There are many initiatives. You must have heard Lusaka Agenda, the Accra Reset, the regional consultation organized by the Wellcome Trust. So WHO is positioning itself in this dialogue on the reform of the global health architecture. Then there are political issues. Again, Taiwan is one. Ukraine is another one. If the item on Iran will be adopted, and I assume it will, there will be definitely a draft resolution, and it may not be easy. If you look at the agenda, you will see there are 2 items on Palestine, and you wonder why. One is a standing item that comes back for the last 30 years, and it has to do with the occupied Palestinian territories, but also with the Golan Heights, so a broader scope. The second one comes from a special session of the Executive Board a couple of years ago, and deals specifically with Gaza and the situation in the West Bank. But as you can imagine, there is a big amount of overlap. But for political reasons, there has never been an agreement to merge the 2, so they stay separate. And then finally, there is the cryptic item 20.2, which is the consideration of the US and Argentina's withdrawal. This was examined by the Assembly, by the Executive Board in February, and the Secretariat put out a rather forceful document saying that the conditions for withdrawal have not been met, either by the United States or by Argentina. The discussion in the board were rather differential. Argentina is a sovereign state, so there is a draft decision arriving at the Assembly that basically acknowledges the withdrawal of Argentina, but doesn't mention the US. So we'll see what happens, because now you cannot kick the can down the road. I mean, there has to be a decision, and people are exploring various possibilities to avoid antagonizing unnecessarily important countries, but also to have a certain position on this very delicate and very sensitive issue. Finally, the programmatic and other issues. One, as you can see, is the working group on the WHO pandemic agreement. Professor Moon mentioned it. It's the attempt to negotiate an annex to the pandemic agreement on pathogen access and benefit sharing that have been unsuccessful until now. So there is a very short procedural decision coming to the Assembly to just extend it for another year. I invite you to look at the document. The draft annex is there. You will see there is not a huge amount of text that has been agreed. And I think many countries are interested in trying to change the method of work, not to continue business as usual. So I think there may be more discussion in Committee A than it seems. And then implementation of the IHR, in particular, extension of the standing recommendations under the International Health Regulation. That's something in the IHR that has never been used until Mpox and COVID-19 ceased to be emergencies. And so I think it's pretty important for public health. What is not on the agenda? First of all, I'm an IHR person, so I'm very attached to that. But there is a novelty introduced by the amendments adopted in 2024, which is a so-called implementation committee. It's like a conference of the parties of the IHR, separate from the WHO. They will meet in September. So there's no need for action by the Assembly, but to me it's a very important step in giving effectiveness to the IHR. Obviously, it will be looming in the room, the process for the appointment of the Director General. This is highly regulated. There is a whole page on the WHO governance webpage. I invite you to look at it, but it's not in the agenda of the Health Assembly. The process was launched in April. There will be many steps that will culminate with the appointment next year. But also, and I'll finish with that, there will be definitely other issues. The hantavirus accident has generated a huge amount of media attention. It's not in the agenda. It will definitely be discussed, maybe under the IHR, maybe under the item on emergencies. And now, as you may have heard, WHO declared an outbreak of Ebola in the DRC and Uganda, another public health emergency under the IHR last night. And so inevitably, it will be discussed under the item on the IHR. So there are many things that are not in the agenda, but they will be in the agenda in a way. So this is the end of my presentation. Sorry I saturated you with information, but at least something to help you navigate the WHA. I am allowed 25 minutes, so I have about 3 minutes for either some questions and answers. After that, I received an electric shock and I have to get off very quickly. If there is any question, there are microphones passing by. Yes, Elaine. The microphone coming. And if you can introduce yourself, please.
Hi, Elaine Fletcher from...
Yeah, it's working.
Elaine Fletcher from Health Policy Watch. Is that working?
No.
Hello?
Yeah, good. Yeah,
Elaine
yeah.
Fletcher from Health Policy Watch. On the process to elect a Director General, you said it's not on the agenda, but as I thought we reported on a document that's supposed to go before one of the committees, I thought, or perhaps it goes before the EB after the Assembly. defining some of the dates for. And
it will
some
go,
of
I think, to the executive board,
the
and
executive
it has to
board,
do
okay.
with the forums, public forums with the candidates, because there will be a big process to reform the process of appointment, and there are two public forums, one before the EB, one after the EB, and the EB will have to decide the dates and some of the modalities. So it will be in the agenda of the EB, definitely. Thank you for reminding me, actually. Any other question? Otherwise, with typical Italian punctuality, I finish, and I thank you for your attention very much.
Thank you, Gianluca, for that very concise overview of the way the Assembly works, always very helpful, I think, especially for newer delegations. I'm going to take the liberty of embarrassing Gianluca just for a moment. He has been a fixture of this briefing for many years, I think longer than I've been involved, certainly. He will be retiring formally from the Graduate Institute this year. Next Wednesday, after we're all recovering from the Assembly, next Wednesday evening, we will be having a special panel honoring Gianluca and his contributions to the practice and academic research on international law and global health law. So I warmly invite all of you to join us online, for those of you who will no longer be here, or in person. That will be next Wednesday. And I do imagine that it will not be his last appearance here at the open briefing. He always comes back due to highly popular demand and his very unique background as both a professor of international law, but also former legal counsel, and therefore very well acquainted with the inner workings of the World Health Organization. So thank you so much. Thank you. It's now my distinct honor to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Hanan Balki, whom I also already mentioned, is of course the regional director of the EMRO region. She's had a distinguished career in the public health system of her home country of Saudi Arabia. She is also no stranger to the inner workings of the WHO Secretariat, having tackled one of the most difficult, I would say, technical and political issues, antimicrobial resistance, before taking on her current role as regional director. One of the reasons I'm particularly keen to hear Dr. Balki's remarks is also because her region, I think, has been witnessing many of the very troubling trends and the rupture of the international system that I was referring to earlier, and I think she is certainly extremely well placed to help us think about how do we continue to make progress in global health at a very difficult moment. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Balki.
Thank you very much, and a good late morning, early afternoon to everyone. I would like to thank the Graduate Institute and the UN Foundation for convening this space year after year. Thank you very much. That discipline of accountability matters more than ever. So the question today is whether global health can still make progress amid rupture. And my answer, obviously, is yes. But only if we are honest about where we stand and bold about what this moment demands of us. As difficult and contested as the current discussion on global health may be, I strongly believe it will catalyze a much broader discussion shift in how we govern and organize health globally. And no better place to start this discussion before the Assembly than here. We are living through the most significant reconfiguration of the multilateral systems since the inception in 1945. And let's be honest, if we were designing the global health architecture today, its mandates, financing structures, and governance arrangements, we would build it very differently, or at least a little bit differently. The current model, or rather the model we have evolved into, has delivered real results. WHO and partners have contributed to major gains in immunization, disease control, maternal and child health, emergency response, and life expectancy. But over time, every unmet challenge became the rationale for a new initiative, partnership, or financing mechanism. The accumulated effect has been fragmentation, overlap, and competition across the increasingly crowded landscape. WHO is not exempt from this critique. Reform must start with honesty, including about ourselves. The UN 80 process reflects a similar realization across the broader UN system, as mandates, efficiencies, and institutional alignment come under increasing scrutiny. When it comes to global health reform, I believe we need to begin from three critical places. First, the lived realities of the countries. Second, the institutions themselves, their mandates, performance, and accountability. And third, the financing realities, increasingly shaping global health priorities. On lived realities, let me take you for a moment to the Eastern Mediterranean region, my region, where I have visited 21 out of the 22 countries and territories, many of them multiple times over the past 2 years since my election or taking office. It has one of the most diverse health profiles among all WHO regions. It hosts millions of refugees and displaced people, fragile states with shattered health systems, and middle-income countries facing a growing burden of non-communicable diseases without the resources to match. At the same time, it has countries with some of the most advanced health systems in the world. For regions like mine, these are not abstract governance discussions. They determine whether fragile states receive sustained support or temporary, fragmented attention, whether displaced populations remain permanently underserved, whether countries can produce their own vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics, or remain dependent on the decisions of others, and whether financing reflects burden of disease or geopolitics. But country realities only tell part of the story. The players shaping the system have also fundamentally changed. We are no longer operating in a system defined only by UN agencies. Today's architecture, including Gavi, CEPI, Global Fund, major philanthropic actors, each with different governance structures, but also CSOs, NGOs, and INGOs with different financing models and different accountability systems. You cannot redesign mandates or align financing until you are clear about who the system is actually being designed around. That is precisely why this joint process matters and why this discussion today is important. It aims to bring and help in bringing clarity. Across global health, reform efforts are multiplying, from the Lusaka Agenda to the Accra Reset, from UN 80 to regional initiatives, and now MOPAN's independent assessment that came out a few days later, and I'm being flooded with reports that have been discussing this topic. And these are very serious efforts, but there remains a lack of convergence. Countries are not asking for more reform process, they are asking for coherence. That is why the 158th Executive Board mandated WHO to convene a joint process bringing together member states, global health initiatives and partners, civil society organizations, and other stakeholders to align these efforts into a more coherent agenda. The third lens is financing. In 2021, member states' dues covered just 12% of WHO's funding. The rest came from voluntary donors. Today, voluntary contributions account for around 80% of what WHO receives. Much of it is earmarked and donor-directed. The result is a system with less flexibility and weaker country ownership. The US withdrawal has intensified the pressure, but it presents much more than just a funding gap. It is a warning that the current model is losing legitimacy, sustainability, and trust. And it makes the shift towards predictable, assessed, and country-driven financing more urgent than ever. This matters because global health reform is not just about coordination. It is about power. Who sets the priorities? Who controls the financing? who decides what gets funded and what does not. At its core, the discussion is about rebalancing power, responsibility, and trust. Multilateralism cannot survive if countries experience it as something designed for them rather than with them. Global institutions should focus on what only global institutions can and should be providing: norms and standards, surveillance, emergency preparedness, and equitable access to innovation. Everything else, including service delivery, health system priorities, and national policy choices, must remain country-led, with international support aligned to national plans rather than to donor preferences. And reform cannot stop at governments and institutions. Communities, civil society, and young people must be genuine co-architects of the system, not symbolic participants within it. The joint process now before the Health Assembly is intentionally time-bound, with a final report to be expected in 2027. Its priorities are straightforward: to align mandates, strengthen accountability, and make financing work for countries. But the model we need cannot be designed for yesterday's world. Climate change, aging populations, antimicrobial resistance, NCDs, and mental health are not peripheral issues. They define the terrain ahead. And an architecture that continues to prioritize infectious diseases while leaving these challenges structurally underfunded is not reform. It is merely rebranding. The gap between the system we have and the system we need has become impossible to ignore. But the gap is also an opportunity. Countries are not walking away from multilateralism. They are demanding a greater role to reshape it and shaping it. And the Global South is not asking simply for a seat at a table designed elsewhere. It is asking to help design the table itself. That is the opportunity before us today, to build global health architecture that reflects the realities, priorities, and responsibilities of the world we live in today. WHO is not asking member states to trust a process. We are asking them to lead the process. Thank you very much. I would like to end by another quote from the Canadian Prime Minister's speech, since that was the title, which caught me when I heard it first. The old order is not coming back. We should not mourn it. Nostalgia is not a strategy. Thank you, everybody.
Yes, are we going to take questions? Yes. So does anybody have any questions for Dr. Balki? There are microphones that will be accessible to you. Yes.
You run away, but you can't hide, huh?
Yes. Are there any questions? Yes, please. Can you introduce yourself?
Thank you. I am Linde Buda from the Konrad Adenauer Foundation here in Geneva. I was wondering, since you talked about changing financing landscape, do you see any countries, perhaps from your region, kind of stepping up in this window of opportunity, redefining their role as donors, or just, changing the way that they have financed before?
Thank you. I think that is the core issue of changing the financing and trying as much as possible not to depend on ODA. So as much as we do hope for countries to continue to support the WHO in flexible funding, as you're all aware, the whole idea, and within the EMRO region, we're really focusing on how can we get the member states to become independent. The language that I like to use, that I've been using in the past 2 years with my member states, is how can I help you get rid of us? How can I help you not need us anymore? That's the basic question. And it's not trying to, as we were saying, we cannot live the past anymore. We need to move away and fast forward. Of course, all donations are welcome.
Good afternoon. Salim Salam, CEO of the World Innovation Summit for Health with the Qatar Foundation and former staff also in WHO, both in the region and in HQ. So I have been very much witnessing those discussions. Since I moved in Qatar, most of my former colleagues, but also a lot of global health actors, come to the GCC, but still with the very much transactional approaches. We found, but others execute and decide. You're referring to that emerging power and the power shift. How do you see our region, not only the GCC, but the MENA region, positioning itself as co-designer, not just as whether founders or recipient of care?
Thank you. A very important question. So I think the MENA region, as I described it, and many of you who are familiar, for the GCC countries, which I've been visiting a lot and hearing them and listening very carefully, they are very keen to become more partners in the actual activities that we are doing. We had just celebrated with KS Relief, for example, 10 years of a partnership, and they're moving more into partnering on the ground. We also prefer to have partners than donors, because that partnership brings trust to the table, and it also helps in capacity building. So I think that's one part. The second part is that what we're trying to do, and this is a dream that I have, is how can we now have the ministries of health and the ministers of health have a larger oversight over health and health provision, instead of them being healthcare providers or leading healthcare provision specifically from the Ministry of Health. So there's big discussions now on the big pictures of health governance at country level, and within the member states and the Gulf countries, they have a lot of learning to experiences that they can share with our other member states. There's a motto that I also adopted from the region to the region during my campaign and during my leadership for the past 2 years, is bringing more of the member states to support each other, and that is also looking into strengthening the national regulatory authorities. Saudi Arabia has ML4, Egypt has ML3, and that is going into being independent. So speaking about it more in a more focused fashion, with a very, very clear vision and target in a few years, hopefully. So there's a lot of learning between the member states taking place. The GCC countries, maybe just to focus on that as well, have been more in bilaterals. We see that the US has now moved into bilaterals. Bilaterals are not a bad thing, as long as we can help in that technical expertise to ensure the harmonization of the language that we're using and the direction that we're taking for the SDGs and other goals that we aspire to globally.
Hi, Katya from WHO Youth Council. My question has to do with the reform and how it affected the WHO health workforce, because we know that the world is currently home to, half of the world's population is under 30 years of age, but WHO actually only employs around 0.6% of people that are under 30. Mm-hmm. And what does that mean for the future of the WHO's health workforce? Because if the older generations, there is a wave of retirements or sick leaves and stuff like that, how do we we prevent the loss of knowledge, the transition, the quality of the handover, and the fact that WHO simply needs to continue being a strong actor in the space of global health? So how does that fit under the architecture reform? Thank you.
That's an interesting question. I think that's an interesting question. I think because I do have an answer. Not that I don't, but I'm not sure if I can say it. So I think a lot of I think I'm proud to say that a lot of our advisors who sit on our boards, our technical consultants, sometimes many of them are experts that are out there. I think the exit of the seniors or the more senior people from the WHO, it's interesting to see that they're always planted within the bigger health ecosystem. I think there does need to be new blood coming in. I think these things don't happen like 100 people are out and 100 people are in. There's always that overlap, and that's what happens in any organization. What I'm trying to do in the EMRO region is to make sure that there's more mentorship and that there's more communities where they're discussing and documenting and showing the younger generation or the people who are coming up. One of the things that speaks exactly to that is what I initiated in mobility and having some of our directors who are not at retirement yet move into country offices and have the people who have been the second or third line leadership start stepping up. So that's a process that requires being mindful on it, and we are doing that in EMRO. I'm pretty sure in the other offices they're doing the same. But any ideas? Happy to take them. Alex, how are you?
Hello.
Yes.
I'm Alex Ross, on the other end of the Youth Council colleague. I've just recently retired from WHO, thankfully.
Nice.
After 22 years. No, a question is, and previously I was at USAID and DFID for another 20 years, and recognizing the shock that happened to the countries. For decades, people have been talking about sustainability and exit strategies, and it frankly hasn't happened, and everything you have said is absolutely on target. And so the question, what I did find, though, is that WHO is not a funder, but its real value is as a strategic planner partner for the government. Mm-hmm. And it's in line with this notion. And I think we missed that opportunity because the talent was there or wasn't there, or the skill base, but it is that vision of making the countries more capable, institution building, but at the same time what WHO can do in terms of its role to be that strategic policy, analytical, strategic planning partner. And it's any ideas there that would be, I think, maybe interesting.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I think what we're doing, again, maybe I can speak also a little bit with my previous AMR hat, but let me focus on EMRO for a minute. What we're trying to have discussions that, again, focus on health governance. Not health care provision, health governance. What does that actually mean? And we're doing that more concretely, as you said, Alex, great question, with countries coming out of conflict. Syria is a great example because they want to, revamp their whole system, and they've received, or they're starting almost from ground zero because of the political situation that took place in Syria. And right now we're in very interesting, fun, and exciting discussions about what does health governance mean in a country, and where should they put their first steps forward? Because, again, resources are going to be very important. And it's very different in designing something in a classroom and doing it on the ground with the real players, while politics is still playing a big role. And that's not just in Syria. That's in Sudan, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Yemen. In most of my countries, that is actually taking place. But the governance issue on health, and as you said, we're also doing that with stable countries and middle and high-income countries to retry and think about what is the best way to govern health across all sectors. So we have revamped much more robustly the Health in All policy agenda. We're moving that one forward. Health financing to not just increase the fiscal space for health, but identifying where other ministry lines need to carry their weight, to carry the burden of diseases that cannot be solved by the Ministry of Health, and so on and so forth. So the governance issues, financing issues, and leadership from the Ministry of Health to the health agenda is something that we're discussing more and more. And that starts by us telling them we're not going to discuss how do we get the next donation. We're going to talk about how are we building your capacity. And that's what we do. And it's good. We don't have money to give anyways. We're not a donor entity. So our best interest is to focus on that governance guidance and technical support.
Good. Okay, yes, I know. Thank you so much. I'm sorry we ran out of time for questions. I wanted to. Good afternoon, colleagues. It's great to see so many familiar faces today. I am Cecilia Mundakasha, Vice President of Global Health Strategy at the United Nations Foundation, and I want to once again thank Dr. Balki for her reflections. As she highlighted, we're really living through a moment of flux, but also at a critical juncture, and she was great for setting the scene for our panel discussion. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge and thank the Graduate Institute Global Health Center. We celebrate together 12 years. Over the past decade, this annual briefing has actually served as an important opportunity for all of us to come together and to take stock at what Global Health Cooperation stands ahead of the World Health Assembly. So, colleagues, we're gathering today on the eve of the 79th Assembly, and it is a moment, as you heard, of profound transition for the global health community. I think I'm going to take you back to the COVID-19 pandemic and how really that was a moment where we were forced to think differently. We were really forced to think about how we can strengthen resilience and preparedness and equity across our countries and institutions. Because no matter where we were, every community was impacted. So we are now faced into a different reality and a different world. And we have seen so many health reforms, initiatives, panels, and reviews and political declarations. Collectively, these efforts have really shown us that the status quo is insufficient. And although we have to celebrate much progress, as Dr. Balki has shared, we've also seen a lot of fragmentation and duplication and uncertainty about how the many pieces actually need to fit together, particularly when we're facing such a difficult financing landscape. That is why the decision at the 158th WHO Executive Board meeting to request a joint process to reconcile and help align recent reform efforts is really significant. The global health community has come to recognize that coherence is a strategic imperative. However, we know that the context surrounding these discussions is not an easy one. My brilliant colleague Suri has already described the strong headwinds we are facing. Geopolitical tensions have deepened since the pandemic. Development priorities are shifting, needs are increasing, fiscal pressures are constraining both domestic and international health investments. And multilateral organizations, including WHO, need to do more with less. So against this backdrop, it remains especially critical to identify and maximize the comparative advantage across the ecosystem. In this regard, WHO's core constitutional mandate is to serve as a trusted global convener where countries negotiate norms, define standards, build consensus, and establish legitimacy for collective action. The challenge ahead is to foster a more coherent and collaborative architecture in which institutions, financing mechanisms, regional actors, and political processes work in greater alignment toward shared objectives with countries at the center. But as we heard today, achieving this ideal will require tough choices and compromises, and all partners have to play a role in supporting that convergence through inclusive dialogue, alignment, and shared ownership. Let's now welcome our panelists to the stage who will help us explore these themes in our discussion. So could our panelists please join me on stage? Is this on? Thank you. Well, I am very excited to introduce this group of experts, all of whom are playing active roles in global health reform discussions. We're joined by Dr. Magda Rovallo. She has had a significant career in global health, previously serving as Minister of Health in Guinea-Bissau, and currently serving as the co-chair of UHC 2030 and the president and co-founder of the Institute for Global Health and Development. We have John Arne Rodingen, CEO of Wellcome Trust. John Arne has held many international roles in health and research, including most recently as the Ambassador for Global Health at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Norway. And prior to that, he was the founding CEO of CEPI. We're also honored to be joined by Her Excellency Mencía Manso de Zúñiga, Spain's ambassador at large for global health, a diplomat and former journalist. Ambassador Mencía Manso has devoted much of her international career to multilateral affairs, occupying different leadership and advisory positions at the Spanish Foreign Ministry and the Agency for International Development Cooperation. And finally, we are joined by Professor Wai Teo. Dr. Teo is Dean of the Sao Siu Hoc School of Public Health at the National University of Singapore and a member of the recently launched Accra Reset high-level panel on reform of global health architecture and governance. So we're thrilled to have such an incredible lineup of global health thinkers here and are excited to tap into all your minds on how we should meet this pivotal moment for global health reform. So let me jump in right away, and I'd like to start with you, Magda. You have, for a long time, emphasized that global health reform must ultimately be judged by whether it strengthens country ownership, equity, and accountability to people and communities. As someone who has navigated the system as a former health minister and now as a co-chair of UHC 2030, I want to ask you what key lessons from country experience are still not being fully integrated into global health reform efforts and discussions? And how can these gaps be addressed to create genuine shifts in how decisions and resources are managed?
Thank you very much for that question, which is quite complex and loaded. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you for the invitation. The first part of your question about how to respond to people's needs. If we think about the fact that today, half of the world's population, 4.6 billion people, don't have access to basic health services, it means we have not been addressing the needs of people. The ecosystem failed and continues to fail people. 2.1 billion people face catastrophic financial expenditure looking for healthcare. So the ecosystem we are looking to build has to respond to these failures. It's not just about fixing global health initiatives because of fragmentation, duplication, and mandates. It is about making sure that we extend basic health services to the people. That's a starting point. I think we need to be extremely careful about how we go about the reforms. Health is politically and diplomatically mediated. Health is a national security issue. The health ecosystem depends on structures that have been built over 80 years. We are talking about the UN 80 Initiative for Reforming the United Nations System. The global health initiatives have been around for about 3 decades. The World Banks, the IMFs, and the World Trade Organizations of this world have been around for several years, and they all have a major influence on health. If we don't look into the bigger picture, we risk, and that's a very high risk, doing a health reform that will not go very far. It is true that as health agents, we don't have the power to change what is happening or going to happen in the fiscal, in the financial space, but we need to interact with the reforms in the global financial architecture and the UN Aid initiative if we are going to change what is the landscape for the future of the health sector. I'm going to give you 5 elements that have been a consequence of the obsolete and outdated health system or global health system that we do have. Number 1, what countries have been living with is displaced, very serious displacement, a wide-ranging consequences of 3 decades of displaced national leadership. Countries have not been able to determine and define what their top priorities are for addressing their country's needs and the needs of the population. The second point is there has been a profound impact on replacement of local knowledge and capacity by very well organized and very well resourced networks of technical assistance, which undermined the local capacity and local knowledge. And we know that knowledge is power. Number 3, the distortion of national budgets has been very impactful. We had billions of dollars of budgets coming to countries bypassing national financing systems, and this will take several years to rebuild. We have seen, and number 4, as an economic undermining of supply chains that have been structured towards the needs of global north industries and discourses of failed markets in the global south or global majority. And last but not least, an absolutely undemocratic accountability towards donors rather than towards communities and people of the nations that deserve better health. So these are some of the major challenges countries have been facing, which I have myself registered during the time I spent at the Ministry of Health, and reforms need to be addressing these fundamental distortions. And of course, they very much depend on the power structures that have been set up many decades ago. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Magda, for sharing this, expansive view of the issues we're facing, particularly at country level. You have seen the scene perfectly for us to start this panel discussion. So now let me turn to John Arne. Welcomes recent regional consultations, surface alignment around the idea that a centralized global health ecosystem should be anchored in regional coordination and backed by a much more leaner, more streamlined global health architecture. So in your view, what is the process to achieve this sort of setup, and how do we move from what of global health reform has to be defined to the how?
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me here and be a part of this panel. And these views, so these directions are really not welcome views. They are views collected after 5 regional dialogues that we supported, but that were hosted and organized by local actors, some of them in the room, and with participants from 114 countries. So really voices from countries. Thank you, Dr. Hanan Balki, for an excellent introduction. But actually, there's one point I disagreed with, and that's what we see from these regional consultations and also the global convening we had in Bangkok a month ago is convergence. And convergence around the principles you just talked about, and we heard from several of you already, and also from Magda. It is convergence towards a system that is much more country-led. It is more decentralized. It's rooted in principles of sovereignty, national sovereignty, but also subsidiarity, making sure that the decisions and the power needs to be closer to the governments elected. So this is then about rebalancing power. It is about clearly country-led decision-making when the global ecosystem works with countries. It is about stronger regional platforms, procurement and regulatory harmonization and collaboration are some examples, but then also a leaner and a more streamlined global architecture. So those are the whys, and you challenge me on the how. And yes, there are many processes related to global health reform, which is good, and I think they have really canvassed, and our sort of attempt is just one of many. I see most of them as sort of listening devices, analytical discussions, but then we need to move towards decisions and actions. And definitely the WHO joint process is one platform. I would also highlight the Accra reset as a really promising opportunity, given that it's really headed and led and championed by a president and head of states, and JJ may mention that more. Because what I am afraid of is this convergence on direction is not translated into specific enough and clear, ambitious ideas and proposals. And I think really we risk just tinkering at the edges of the system. We risk treating symptoms, but really not the root causes. And I think we risk being far too cautious and not be sufficiently courageous in what we want to do. So I would like to actually suggest some what can we do? And I think we need to understand that the world is a very different place today than 30 years ago. We have seen economic development, really good. We have seen a lot of positive developments in health outcomes, just alluded to by Suri in her introduction. I think we need a much more differentiated approach. I think we need a differentiated approach rooted in countries and domestic resource mobilization and political accountability at country level. So what does that mean? I think we need to concentrate the global support efforts, financial aid, technical assistance, to much fewer countries and fewer contexts. Yes, humanitarian and context and fragile states, and the lowest income countries. So we need a concentration. But then we need a broadening of the scope of the global system, how we support. And we heard it from Hanan. We cannot only give countries the opportunity to get financial support for infectious diseases and some other conditions. We need to broaden the arsenal of opportunities, because that's the only way to actually deliver on one plan, one budget, and one monitoring, and leaning on country priorities. And to do so, I think we need a much leaner global system. We have been successful in scaling up technologies and solutions. I would suggest that we should focus the efforts on that around one organization that is really providing market shaping, potential pool procurement, but to all commodities that can deliver both infectious disease, mental health, and NCD opportunities. We should then really provide support to health system strengthening for these lowest economies, the lowest income economies. And that should be on budget, and not as today, where we bypass system, just mentioned by Magda. And that is the business model of the multilateral development banks. But we know that the multilateral development banks tend not to prioritize health. So how can we actually be committing the development banks and the international financial system to invest in human capital and link grant financing for health systems to concessional loans? And finally, we need to move away from pandemic preparedness and health security being financed by aid. It's not aid. It's a collective investment for health security for all of us. We did, and I was sort of partly responsible for that, we did create the pandemic fund with the goal to create a new resource mobilization mechanism for non-aid resources. Unfortunately, almost all of the resources coming into the pandemic fund is from aid budgets. So we failed at the starting point. We need to think differently. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing those key findings, as you said, from the regional committees welcome hosted, but also the global one in Bangkok, and for bringing forward these really bold ideas on how we actually put these ideas together through an inclusive global process. So we'll continue with you, Ambassador. Spain and your Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, have demonstrated exemplary leadership in global health, most recently through your decisive support during the hantavirus outbreak. The collaboration between your government, WHO, and other authorities serves as a textbook case for why a functional global health architecture is essential to address emerging challenges. So Spain has for a while been the forefront of this agenda, and thanks to the high-level political buy-in, has positioned itself as a champion of reform, including through your initiative like the Sevilla platform. So we know, however, that those reforms only endure when they align with country realities. And so my question for you is, how is Spain translating its vision for reform into these concrete commitments, and why is your approach to building a coalition around this vision?
So thank you very much, Cecilia. It is a real pleasure to be here, and thank you to the UN Foundation for organizing this event. I am humbled to actually share this panel with all these extremely knowledgeable people in the global health sphere. I am a social scientist, so this is a first disclaimer. But I do know that I am here not for myself, but for the country I represent, which is Spain, and the position it has occupied over the past year in trying to bring a constructive vision to global health reform and the whole global health reform debate. So thank you. Before I give the Spain's vision, where we stand and how we see this process, I'm going to go into some of the elements that have been discussed by Dr. Balki and my fellow panelists today, and where our vision comes from. So basically, from the Spanish side, there is an absolute recognition that there is a need for a reconfiguration of the system, and it's based on some operational considerations, which, as on our side, we see, as John Arne said, there's quite a bit of convergence, in identifying what the fails are, what the flaws are. Financing, certainly, duplication, fragmentation, the need for country alignment. So if we do have this diagnosis that is widely shared, why are we not being able to move into action? Why are we failing on the how? And here would be my second recognition, which would be that this is a wider process, and this is what Magda Robelo was saying. This is also a reconfiguration of narratives. And the reconfiguration of the narrative around global health is a very deep, very complex process. And as policymakers, we do need to acknowledge it. We cannot just look at the operational side of things. We need to acknowledge the narrative change. And there are many tensions within the global health ecosystem right now that need to be addressed when we are looking at this reform. So we have the tension between global health and development, between global health and sovereignty, between global health and security, among others. And then there's also the issue of the expectations we are all as countries placing on the system, Are they either realistic, and how can we move along on those expectations? And then there's the issue of trust. And these are all linked. And we will not move on the operational side of things if we don't move on the narrative side of things. And there are some really solid initiatives, and here the Accra Reset is commendable on how it's broaching this issue also from that perspective, and we find that very important. And then the third recognition from the Spanish side is that reform is also happening. It's not that nothing is happening, which sometimes also is one of the tendencies we have when we speak about this, is things are changing, but they need direction. And the pieces are moving, but we need to make them move far enough, and in the right direction. And that's where the Spanish vision comes in, what we can bring to the world. We are very much a middle country, middle-sized, middle contributor. So we are part of the system, and going back to Mark Carney, we benefit from the system, so we want to defend the system. So what we bring to the table and what we offer the world right now would be the drive, the momentum. This was something that appeared in the concept note, momentum versus fragmentation. What we aspire to bring is momentum and political drive, and this is what at the 4th Financing Conference for Development we tried to do. We did. Before over 50 heads of state gathering in Spain, we tried to put the global health agenda center stage. And that's what it was about, really, And this is what the Sevilla platform really offers the world, you know, a political platform for action at the highest level. It does not aspire to fragment. It does not aspire to build layer upon layer of initiatives. On the contrary, the way we have broached the development of the debate is in a listening mode and a receiving mode, and really trying to connect the dots, because that's what we believe we are strong at. So our Prime Minister has supported within the AU Summit, the side event that led to a high-level declaration on reform architecture. Spain was there, you know, and we really backed that effort. When France came to us and said, would you support, within the One Health Summit, an initiative to reform the global health architecture, to bring high-level support for it? Of course we were there, and we will continue being there, supporting and trying to connect all these different initiatives. And then one third element we bring to the table, I think, is introspection, you know, or walking the talk. And that's what maybe we have seen at the hantavirus response operative. So this is one thing our Prime Minister said in one of the press conferences, and for us it was very useful. As Spain, we are willing to provide help to the world, but we're also ready to ask for it, because this is what the global system is for. And we asked for it and we got it, and we needed the global coordination and the global cooperation, and that's the system in action. And we need to put it forth that it works, you know, but we need to take hold of it. So that's one of the things. And then also within this introspection is like trying to see what we bring to the system. And in the whole sovereignty debate, what we view as really relevant is sovereignty through integration. This is something that has worked for Spain. You know, sovereignty doesn't necessarily mean going back into yourself, folding back into your national borders. On the contrary, you will gain more sovereignty if you manage to have a system that you can depend on, and that, you know, it's really integrating and collaborative. And last but not least, it's the vision that brings it all together. 1 year ago, we presented a global health strategy where we view health as a human right, health as a global public good, and that it needs to be defended from this multilateral, global coordinated perspective. So we believe in self-reliance through cooperation and common rule and standard setting that we must respect all as nations. So there's where the WHO process comes in. From the Spanish side, we are 100% supportive of this process. We believe it is necessary. We believe it is the one process that has the legitimacy to bring together all the actors and to bring together a truly global vision. And there, as members of the Executive Board until 2028 and of the PBAC, we will do our utmost to support these processes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador, for sharing Spain's vision for mobilizing political support to translate commitment into action. And now I'm going to turn to you, Professor Teo. For those who haven't followed, you know, the actual global health architecture reform discussions, this can sound like a little abstract. The Reset initiative is set to produce concrete, actionable proposals to restructure the global health order. And we already heard from a few panelists that there's a lot of hope that this actually can help us move forward. As a member of the high-level panel for the Reset, could you speak to how this effort is different from other aid reform agendas and why it's so urgent now?
Thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here. And before I start, I should also mention that Magda is also a fellow member on the high-level panel, so it's not just me that you have that's here from the Reset. And I think I'll just answer the second question first on why is it so urgent. I think it's very clear from the presentations and from the speeches this morning that the current architecture is struggling to to find real solutions to some of the big problems that the world has faced. Issues around pandemics, climate, we keep hearing about it, AMR, but actually there is also a very much rising burden of the non-communicable diseases that is going to affect the world. There is this problem that has emerged over the past 18 months in a big way, which is misinformation. And these are all big problems that needs a global effort to come and address. But at the same time, I think there's this issue around the current global health architecture is unable even to help countries address some of their service delivery of health, not necessarily just healthcare. So I think this is part of the reason why there is a very strong lens on the urgency. Now, you asked the question earlier on what is different. I think I will list it in three manners. The first is really, when we think about a lot of these reform dialogues, there's often this perspective that it's driven by donors, it's driven by technical agencies. But I think this is where the Accra Reset is actually a political reform that is focusing really on how power, authority, decision-making, and accountability operates. And that in itself, it's going to report directly to the Presidential Council. So it is going to be presented to the policymakers, to the governments, the leaders of countries, that it is in their actions that matters. The second, it's rooted in the leadership of the Global South. And I think this is where issues around sovereignty, around financing, governance, and also the bit about the duplications that we keep hearing this morning around institutional coherence that will be addressed jointly rather than having a reform conversation around financing, a reform conversation around governance on its own. And the third part that is very different, it's a very clear focus on implementation. Understanding who are the key actors that will own, that will drive these reforms, and with the lens on long-term sustainability that is very much centered around, again, principles of sovereignty and subsidiarity. So not really only what reforms are needed, but also understanding the how, the who, and the by when. Now, all of this may sound very abstract, so I will perhaps use a couple of examples in the work streams that we've been working on, which is around this principle of regionalization, which Jon Arne spoke briefly about, which is really around the Accra Reset coming to understand and articulate very clearly what is the value add of regional entities and what are some of the functions and roles that are best placed to be operated at the regional level, not necessarily at the global level. And some of the functions, through the lens on value add and best placement, actually includes markets and manufacturing. When we think about markets, there is this aspect of pooled procurement. Manufacturing, there's this aspect of regional manufacturing of the key medicines, not necessarily just the vaccines and the diagnostic tools, but in broader sense on medicines, what would be a better place at the regional level. Regulations, I think I come from a part of the world where we are now starting to look at whether a harmonized regulatory framework or having useful reference regulatory authorities to guide the national regulatory authorities around. It's able to help the region actually uplift. And in performing joint pharmacovigilance, post-market surveillances, these are regulatory aspects that through a regional lens actually becomes a very powerful addition to this principle of supporting national regulatory authorities in their function. So the regionalization doesn't deviate from the principle of national sovereignty in health, but actually augments, and because it's well placed to support government from a context specific, from a cultural specific, and actually mobilizing regional technical experts typically tend to be a lot more efficient and cost savings than mobilizing international technical experts. There's also the element on workforce and talent development. And this is again where are there elements on regional centers of excellence that could be developed to support the training of human resources for health, not just the medical professionals, but also people who are able to perform health technology assessment, health economists, people who are trained in health promotion strategies to understand the long-term benefits of that. And within a much more regional context, the cultural relevance and specificity is going to be much more appropriate than always relying on a global mobilization of technical experts. And I think this is really where we see a fundamental difference in the Accra Reset. And I'm not sure at this point, I could also tap on Magda, because you have also been working on some of the work streams. Do you have any addition to add?
Thank you, Professor Teo, for those insights. And I think we heard really interesting points for from each one of you. And now I want to ask you, the four of you, the same question. And I want to cross-check to see where we're landing. But as we heard from Dr. Balki and the joint process that she outlined, I want to hear from you about how do you think we can use this opportunity to actually move forward. What are the most significant risks we're facing to really have and move, like Ambassador Mencia said, about moving from momentum to actually create meaningful and lasting change? And how can your specific work help mitigate those risks? So we'll go on reverse order, and we'll turn to you, Professor Teo, for your reflections.
Thanks very much. I'll just perhaps touch on the most significant risk that I see, and I will mainly highlight two of them. I think the first is the complacency and the hubris, which is really coming from institutions or leaders saying that actually the problem with this global health architecture is not my organization, the problem lies elsewhere. And even when we talk about the duplication, my institution, my organization is doing the right thing. It's someone else that's duplicating my effort. And I think that if that is the mindset where organizations take going into this global health reform, that is one major risk that I see. And the second major risk that I see is this concept of fragmented reform. Because, again, we are hearing that there are multiple reform dialogues that's happening, which in itself is good, because as more actors talk about it, you are able to land on understanding what are the key issues. But when the solutions are being found, I worry that there will be a solution for understanding what is the global health architecture reform that is needed, which is separate from what are the national sovereignty, health sovereignty principles that are being laid out. And more importantly, the regionalization group that is talking about reforms on regionalization, again, takes off on a separate movement. This fragmentation, there is a real risk that it is happening. And I think that those are some of the risks that I see.
Thank you so much for that, Ambassador.
So yeah, completely agree with those two risks identified, and maybe building up on that, I would highlight two different ones. One of them is actually the urgency. I mean, we keep on saying we do need urgent action, but as we have seen, this is a very complex problem, and we do need the trust building that goes with a reform to happen while it happens. So the urgency is important. But the problem with the urgency is that it creates expectations of immediate delivery. And if that immediate delivery is not met, then there's fatigue. And fatigue is probably the worst thing we can have with this reform process, because it will lead to that complacency and to that inaction, so this gatopardismo of not moving, of changing everything, but not moving anything. So yes, we do need urgent action, but we need to be careful. We cannot say if it doesn't happen urgently, it's not happening. We need to keep at it. So there's this constancy that we need. And then the second one, and linked to it, is the financing, leaving behind the financing. I mean, the financing is something that needs answers. So we need to combine maybe a multi-level response of having some specific answers, of looking for resources immediately and doubling down on this resource mobilization at the domestic level and at the international level, but also trying to connect, to have a more intersectorial vision of financing and health, and trying to create with a longer-term vision, those connections nationally, regionally, and globally, and there, work, all these different initiatives work together to bring more coherence to the system.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Janarne?
Yeah, really good, interesting reflections, and I don't disagree on both of those. But just reflecting in a way, what kind of reform process do we really see emerging now? And Suri talked about the difference between sort of a global health architecture reform and an ecosystem reform. And in a way, I think we need both. And maybe that could be the fast and the slow. And how do I think in that way? The architecture is the house model. Simplifying the house, taking down some walls, and thinking about the structures, because structures have an impact, and because structures are normally linked to financing flows, and without clarity on structures and mandate for those structures, finance will not flow. At the same time, ecosystem, if that is sort of a self-organizing entity, as it is, and ruled by the laws of nature, as Suri mentioned, the problem is if you completely say it's ruled by the laws of nature, and the laws of nature in this aspect is geopolitics, and then we can just lean back and say we cannot affect it. I think that is the slow process that Mencia just talked about, the need for building a collective narrative, rebalancing power, and so forth. I should say, so I am concerned about the risk being that we are not bold enough, really, and that we become incremental instead of going for bolder reforms. And I'm really concerned about the current drafted mandate for the joint WHO process, because that's really, in an architecture point of view, it's about changing the wallpapers and the colors of the painting. Because it's clearly said that that process should not look at roles and responsibilities for the individual organizations. It should not propose any institutional change across organizations. And that's bollocks, in a way. I understand why you need to say it. I understand it, because governance is fragmented in the governing bodies of all these organizations, so I understand. But in a way, that takes out all the ambition and all the opportunity of that process. I was first very skeptical that WHO should, now I'm very open, host that process, because it will easily become too political and too member states driven and without clarity on what are the opportunities. Then I became more sort of optimistic, because yes, this seems to generate at least political attention and commitment. But then when I see the mandate, I'm really not sure. And member states in the room, you still have 5 days to fix that. Go ahead.
Thank you for that, John Arne. Magda?
I agree with the points raised by the previous speakers. Just to add to that, I think we have two major risks. One is the short-termism and impatience to see the reform process completed, and therefore focus on operational issues rather than focusing on the more strategic, more political, and more difficult issues to change. If we are going to really initiate meaningful, genuine change, we need to look into the mindset that created the institutions and the systems we are dealing with right now. Mindset change will not happen overnight, but at least if we look into the doctrines, the frameworks that were at the beginning of the conceptualization of the systems we have now, then we can go for the short, medium, and long-term reform actions that will bring meaningful change. If we think fixing mandates, merging organizations are going to solve the problem, then we will miss the points. The second major risk is to believe that because we are talking about sovereignty, it is enough to do cosmetic change around regional and national structures to get it done. And finally, the bigger risk is for those with the power to make the change, to lack the will to see change happening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Magda, for that. And we have time now for questions from the audience. I see a hand on the back. Can you please introduce yourself and then ask the question? Yes, and there are two of them. Can we take them together because we don't have much time? Thank you.
My name is Raj. I used to work for UN and other international organizations. The word reform has been used so many times that it has lost the intensity of what it really means. So I'm trying to address Mr. Rottingen. Is it just the reform in the architecture that is required in the world, or is it a reboot of the system? Reboot means you kind of sunset what is happening, and it's a kind of a change of mindset, because otherwise what we see is in the name of reform, there are agenda items every year, this thing, and those are cosmetic bandages here and there, but not really the reform as it means. And also I think linked to that is Hannah's presentation about the process. How can this process be objective if it is led by the central architect, central stakeholder? WHO is the main stakeholder in the health sector. How can it be objective if it is led by the same kind of format?
Thank you. We'll take the other question.
Hello, I'm a consultant in the pharma sector, but I'm here today as a former research scientist and an interested citizen. But we've discussed a lot about the ecosystem. I also share the less positive view that if reforms really depend on political will, I'm sorry, but many of you may share my view, we don't have that much inspiring politicians currently. So if that is already a struggle, are there other players that we can pull into the ecosystem? And this may mean just adding more fuel to the fire, but I'm thinking specifically about the organizations I work with. They have an interest, pharma companies have an interest. Can they also be called to have responsibilities in shaping these ecosystems? And which responsibilities would those be?
Thank you. We'll have two more questions here, and then we'll turn back to our panelists.
Good morning. My name is Naim Al-Qasir. I'm from Bahrain. I'm a nurse midwife who served in WHO for 26 years and knew WHO since age 10 from primary school. My question is, we heard about reform, sovereignty, and very well said we should go back to the conceptualization, how the organization is established. If I go there, the sovereignty of the member states that are the votes, they are the ones who are speaking, we should focus on going back. And my question is, I did not hear the sovereignty member states within the WHO as a governing body. This is something we missed. I was a civil servant. I was not WHO running the globe. As a civil servant versus a sovereign country having a voice. And that's the power struggle should come within the assemblies and things. I'm raising it because I heard a lot about sovereignty, but I didn't hear that we are sovereign as member states represented within the World Health Assembly and have a say. The power struggle to be handled.
And there's one last one here, and then we'll turn to the panelists.
Thank you very much for your talk. I am Adela Santos. I am postdoctoral visiting fellow at Global Health Center. My work focuses more on political and institutional implementation at domestic level and national level, from particularly from parliaments. In my current work, I was working on social network analysis, and I'm looking for how coordination patterns change under stress. So something I am finding interesting is that of the power of middle powers or intermediate actors as fundamental to maintain coordination connections across a fragmented system. So from your perspective, in this period of geopolitical and refounding reconfigurations opportunity, what kind of coordinations arrangement could become most important for sustained collective action? Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'm sorry, but we ran out of time for more questions, so we're going to turn to our panelists. I don't know who wants to come in response to any one of the 4 questions we heard. You can take the microphone. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, and really good questions, and I cannot address all of them, definitely. The role of WHO, yes, member states are governing WHO, so that's a fact. Member states are governing all UN organizations. At the same time, one analysis I would definitely say is that there is a lot of competition between UN agencies in countries. WHO versus UNDP versus UNFPA, and so forth. UNICEF, I can include many. So yes, in theory, there should be a system that is clearly governed. The member states have clarity on what they want, but that's not the reality. And I think we need to discuss the reality and not the theory. I think the executive board of WHO is not strong enough as a board, so it means that there is a lack of accountability clearly to the organization, and that's a reform of WHO, not a global health system, just as offered to that. And maybe to continue provocations, role of the pharma sector, yes, I think private sector has an important role to play if they think long-term enough, because the big markets, and President Alexander Stubb of Finland is clearly saying this, who will run the world in 30 years from now? It's the emerging economies, it's Africa, it's Asia, it's other regions, and that's where the markets are. But unfortunately, pharma companies are thinking this year, next year, and a couple of years, because they are run by shareholders. And the main concern of pharma companies and all their energy now, more or less, is used to balancing profits across Europe and North America because of the most favored nations sort of clause and the concerns, how can we maintain the level of economic activity? Very well understood and really important issues, because we need a more fair pricing regime around the world. But I would just offer that they don't have the bandwidth either. We need political will. President Mahama of Ghana has shown that will. He needs to partner with other presidents. Yes, they are in the Presidential Council, but they are so far only the Global South. That's not enough. 55% of the economy in the world is G7, more or less 55% at least, if you think that richer countries should contribute more. G20, around 85%. It means that there are a few countries that actually need to contribute financially to the system, and that is not that's not one country, one sort of penny each. There is a differential, and we need to reach out to the big economies.
Thank you. I think Professor Doe.
I'll try and attempt to piece a few things together that the questions have been asked. One, it's really around sustained change. One, it's around, the first question was, is this truly a reform, and is a reboot the process of that? And I'll just use the people, the panels on the stage. I'm a professor from a university. So university, we have someone from the university. We have Jan Arne, who is a funder and a leader in the space of reform. We have also two leaders in the countries who are setting their priorities, tackling the delivery of health services for the people. And one version of the reform that I ask myself, because I'm a university leader, is that can I get my professors to change the way that they act when it comes to health? That they are no longer just publishing and getting grants and publishing and getting grants, but working with policymakers to tackle some of the real-world problems in their own setting, in their own country, in their own neighborhood in the region. At the same time, would it be possible to ask not just Jan Arne or the Wellcome Trust, but also other funders that are in the room, that the funding model moving forward is actually no longer just funding academic research, but also incentivizing professors to work with governments, to have pots of funds to support policy-directed research, where the questions come fundamentally from the governments, not from the professors. And that's where I suspect now the health ministers are going to say, well, I have access to local or regional teams of technical experts that I don't need to pay a lot of money to international experts to help me, because these people understand the culture, understand the context. So that is the version of reform that it's in my court that I have to think about. And I think this is exactly where we need the people, not just on stage, but actually here, to start reflecting on how can you do your own job differently that will make a real-world difference. Because that's exactly what I suspect Your Honor has been thinking a lot, because I can see the changes that Wellcome is putting in the way that is looking for funding. My university, we are trying to put in the same change as well, to make sure that my professors now are working with countries to tackle their priorities, not because I have a professor who's working on HIV and wants to go around solving HIV problems. I think that is the way that I see reform in my own capacity. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Just a quick contribution to the reform conversation is to say, before COVID-19, ODA started declining, and there were a clear understanding that things were not working well. COVID-19 pandemic accelerated the understanding that we needed reform, because if Global South needs commodities to fight a pandemic that are not available and accessible, and vaccines and other products are only available when others are served, then we have a problem. But that became critical in January 25, when suddenly people realized that if a single donor could say, today it is over, and then tomorrow you don't have medicines for your people, then you realize how big the dependency is. What we are talking about here, the reform is about removing the dependency that exists right now, giving global majority countries the ability to make decisions, to pay for their decisions, and be able to feed, nurture, educate, and provide health to their people. For that to happen, you need to move some of the strings that attach the economies that generate money for investing nationally. That's what the reform we're talking about is reducing towards closing the dependency that exists today. And that's what we need to work on. If we just work on operational issues, we will not solve the problem. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Colleagues, we've come to the close of our discussion, and we just have enough time for any one of our panelists to have 60 seconds or less if you want to share any key takeaway messages for the audience. Yes.
So yeah, from our perspective, we have the system that reflects who we are. So let's look at ourselves and see what we want from the system. And as was said here, the WHO process is governed by the countries. Let's get involved at the maximum level. And let's help it through with political leadership and political convening of like-minded actors overall that hope to see a system that works better and delivers better for all. Thank you.
Thank you. Gennady.
Yeah, we've forgotten almost to say this, but this is about people on the ground. Magda mentioned how a decision in a capital one day can lead to lack of services and medicines for people a couple of days later. Millions will die because we are not able to reform sufficiently fast. That reform is also about accountability of national leaders in the countries. It's not only about the global system, and that needs to happen quickly. Health is political. One of the introductions said that earlier. Consensus normally don't achieve the biggest sort of ideas and reform opportunities. I think we need to see this as a political struggle. That means there needs to be political engagement. I don't believe totally unanimity sort of decision at the World Health Assembly will reform the system. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all our panelists for their candor and valuable insights. Please join me in giving them a hand as they exit the stage. Thank you. I know before you leave. I just want to say a few words before you leave. On behalf of the United Nations Foundation and the Graduate Institute, I want to thank you all for joining us today in person, and for those who have joined us online. It has been truly a rich discussion and an energizing start of our week. As we have heard today, change is inevitable, and global health cannot escape from that. And as we heard today from our speakers, the future of global health is neither linear nor predetermined. We hold the power to change it ourselves. And despite challenges, we've also heard that WHO and this assembly remained a vital forum for shaping constructive global health cooperation on complex issues. As Jonathan said, we have 5 days to make this right. Ultimately, however, the transformation will not be realized solely through a resolution passed by this assembly. And we heard from Professor Teo today, it is on us. We can actually be the actors of that change, and it is our responsibility to turn these ideas and commitments into action. So with that, I'm going to close, and I want to thank everyone. I want especially thank the Graduate Institute and the Institute of Philanthropy for hosting our reception, that for you joining in person can actually, after this, join us for. And as you may understand, anybody who has planned an event, this is only possible through a team from the Graduate Institute and the UN Foundation. They are rock stars, and I'm very thankful for their support to make this possible. Thank you so much.